what we're going to do, and all of the topics that we cover, and I know we have many experienced gardeners in the audience as well, are probably worth a whole program, but we're just going to go through some hints and some tips and some operations that you can do to continue to either improve your soil or to continue to keep it healthy. So, and a little reminder for all of you is that soil is not dirt. It's an soil is almost in itself a living organism composed of the mineral component, the organic component, and all the life. And we'll talk about that in a minute. The left-hand side is kind of a periodic reminder as we go through. It's an anathema to gardening and farming and keeping things going. And that is, it's an anathema to have any bare soil throughout the whole seasons. This is just a quick reminder of what we're working toward. Healthy soil, you'll see in the pie chart at the lower right-hand corner, and we can study more on this at another time. But healthy soil is composed of minerals and active chemistry and active biology. And I like this word tilth. Basically, that kind of encompasses everything you're working for a healthy soil. And you'll see in the hand at the right that it has a nice crumbly texture, the right amount of moisture, lots of living organisms in it. And this is what we're going to be working toward. And it smells good too. And here's a slide that you can come back to. It's just kind of a review of the soil web. And it's actually what we're all working for is to really, and I do have a pointer, okay. all this work that's going on underground is what contributes to breaking down organic material and contributing to the health of your soil and the nutrients that you need there. And the lower right-hand box shows that it's actually a fairly small skin on the earth, but it's really important. And just again, another way to review what's involved in keeping your soil healthy. And feeding, if you feed the soil, you feed the plants, and they can feed us. And again, back to, we're going to go through these 1, 2, 3, 4, and just an introduction to irrigation at the end. Most of these are focused on things that you can do to improve your soil. And again, this mantra that your soil, in order to be healthy, needs to be covered at all times. Otherwise, you lose nutrients, you lose components, it dries out, it gets cracked. Water doesn't filtrate. And so by keeping organic material or plants growing in your soil is really important. So let's go ahead and go to mulch. Excuse me. The reason I put this up is to give you some hope. If you're starting a garden from scratch or you have very poor soil, there's a number of things that you can do. So try not to panic. But this is a view of the West Side Community Garden in the beginning. We had the opportunity to establish this garden on some city property, which had been growing kind of naturally, almost like a meadow for a number of years with some alfalfa, some perennial grasses, some sunflowers, a few weeds, and a few other things like that. Well, one of our supporters decided that in order to, which is a good idea, I guess, to create a base for our garden, came in and brought in not soil, but fill, and leveled it in the area that we wanted to garden. But I'll point out to you that this is what it looked like. The fill that was brought in was not soil. Those of you that know soils know that at the sea horizon is just nothing but calcium carbonate. So this is a fine dust. It does have volcanic ash in it, which is actually a plus for our area for gardening and farming because it brings in some really essential nutrients. But we realized right away that, and you can see the color, this is basically talcum powder dust. If you put water on that, first of all, it'll bead or maybe run off and take a long time to sink in. And then if it does sink in, chemical reactions happen and it turns into clay. So our first job before we could even open the garden, we started collecting bags of leaves in the fall and purchased several dump truck loads of finished compost from a company in our area that was actually composting on site at a feedlot and dairy. And it was certified organic. That was brought in and spread, and then we sprinkled on as many leaves and grass clippings and things. You can see the bags here in front, and then also a line back here, and just let it rot for over the winter. This little note about sulfur, we'll come back to that because it is a technique that has some influence on the microbial processes that take place if you add sulfur to a heavy mulch. It does help to change the chemistry and aid some of the microbes that are going to process through that. So there is hope. Okay, so let's talk about mulch. One thing about mulch is it can come in a couple of forms and be used in different ways in your garden. This illustration of establishing a garden shows two kinds: the use of wood chips and grass clippings, and then inorganic mulch to protect the soil and do a little solarizing against weeds in the form of a fabric. And this can be a plastic, red, clear, green. In this case, this is a permeable fabric because they're going to establish a pathway here. And this is what West Side Garden looked like a few years later. And what this photograph illustrates is the use of mulch. You'll notice that the soil is covered. In this case, it's grass clippings on top of layers of newspaper or cardboard. And it's really amazing that this will break down in a season or two. And also what will happen is these vining plants will spread and shade this area. And you'll also know some planting that has gone through a permeable black fabric here, which is a really good idea because it does hold moisture and does reduce weeds. And another example of several different treatments. Again, here's a permeable fabric that you can purchase, which allows the exchange of air and water. It also prevents evaporation, which is one thing we're after in our climate with our concerns about water. Here's a gardener that planted some of the heat-loving crops in red plastic, which is also considered a mulch. So anything that you can collect, you have to be careful collecting grass clippings from your neighbors. When we started West Side Garden, I went around with my pickup and started getting bags of grass clippings and then in the fall leaves to use as a winter mulch. And people would come out and they'd wonder why I was collecting their garbage. The thing you have to be careful about in using something, actually in any organic mulches, is to know the source. You wouldn't want to mulch with grass clippings that come from a lawn where they use weed and feed, because these substances can last a really long time. It's possible to put them into a compost pile and keep them there for a while, but it's best to really know. And if your wood chips are coming from the chipping of, say, pallets or wood that's been treated, you wouldn't want to use that on your garden either, because those effects are pretty dramatic. Another thing to note when you're using mulch in your garden is, especially as you mulch through the season, what we have a tendency to do here in southern Idaho is our soils stay cold for quite a while. In the spring, you can warm your soil in preparation for seeding or planting, but you just want to make sure that the mulch is kept away from the basic basis of your small plants. This is obviously later in the season, but let's see. And just another example of gardening where there's the thing to note here is this is probably halfway, maybe not quite into the season. And you'll notice that the soil is completely covered against wind and water erosion. Okay, this is my alert slide to talk a little bit about the challenges of gardening in southern Idaho and a lot of other places. And that is that our season is really short. And again, we're back to that issue of when can you plant and how to plant early. A lot of gardeners like to use, let me go back here. A lot of our gardeners like to use clear or dark plastic to pre-warm their beds. Gardening in some mounds or some upper rows or other techniques allows the soil to dry out and to warm up faster. The other thing that it does is, I'll go back again here too. The other thing that it does is if you're pre-warming your garden beds or using plastic, you get an extra benefit of you also start germinating weeds. And we'll talk about that later because that's actually a good thing because you can get them started to germinate because you've turned the soil and you can start tackling those weeds when they're small. So this is the challenge of gardening in southern Idaho. Another caveat for your gardening, and this is challenging because we all want to be in our gardens early, is that avoid compaction of your soils. We're kind of jumping around between some gardening tips, but obviously you don't want to use heavy equipment like this. And we'll talk a little bit about tilling later, but try to avoid walking on your wet soils because compaction also has a destructive effect on what's going on under the ground. As tempting as it is to get into your garden, it's best to wait until things have pretty well dried out. And we're back to just some illustrations of gardening pathways. You'll notice here that there's mulching going on in this row. Often when we start our gardens in the spring, we're anxious to get in there. It's too early maybe to plant or to seed. But it's a good idea to at least begin, not with heavy mulching, but to mulch your pathways according to your garden design. And I also do this with, say, some grass clippings or some small wood chips because I'm a klutz and I need to know where to walk in my garden. Okay, this is a good place to pause, and I look forward to hearing from all of you, whether you have questions or whether you have tips or methods that you've used that have been successful, whether you're starting a garden from scratch or you've been gardening for a number of years and you just want to follow some tips on how to keep your garden healthy. So we're going to go on to compost next, but Christy, if we have some questions, let's take a pause.
No questions yet. If you're new to Zoom and you'd like to post a question, go down to the bottom of your screen and you'll see a little chat icon. Just click on that and it'll open up the chat box, and then you can post your questions there.
We'll just take a brief pause here. Let's see.
Okay, Sue, nothing so far. I will step in if some questions come in after you start up again. How would that be?
Okay, that's just right. I'll just lecture a little bit more about this business of, and we can go into some more detail. We're basically dealing with ideas of stuff that's free or almost free, takes some labor, but you can let Mother Nature do her thing. But I've got my sign up there about always keeping soil covered I was observing this last fall a gardener who cleaned their plot immaculately compared to my garden plots, and removed all of the visible vegetation and then tilled it out 6 inches or so. And that fall it was very dry and garden water was shut off. And guess what? The wind blows in Idaho, and that those particular plots were just being stripped bare. There was nothing to hold the soil in place or to contribute to its nutrients the next year. So anyway, okay, so let's go on to compost. Now this is something that we're trying to mimic with a lot of labor or a little bit of labor, whether you mulch a layer on your garden or you get really serious about composting. But basically what we're trying to mimic is what happens in a forest. If you, or a good grassland, if you walk, you're able to walk across a really spongy ground because all of this is going on naturally in the forest where there's no disturbance from leaf litter and dying plants and dying animals, dying fungi at work. So this is kind of what we're trying to mimic with composting. Now, all of us have had this experience, so you can read this. I will read it to you from a quotation. It says, building a compost pile may create more anxiety and obsession among gardeners than any other gardening activity. And most of us can relate to that. So before you start a pile, remember one thing is to relax if you can. And I know it's hard to relax in your garden, but it's really important to try to enjoy it during the season and observe plants and animals and insects, look for voles and other things. But the idea is supposedly gardening is to be healthy and relaxing for you. And there are stressful times when the Idaho winds come up and you're trying to cover against an early frost. But anyway, so the first thing you do to start a compost pile, I'd recommend is you buy 60 acres near a dairy. Oh no, that's not practical. So I'm going to demonstrate a couple of techniques and tips that we've all tried, some successful, some not, remembering that our season is short and our soils are cool to cold in Idaho. But this beauty happens to be my compost pile at the back of my home lot under a lilac hedge. Now, some of you may say that is not a thing of beauty, but I'm a lazy composter and I want to create compost. So throughout the whole year, I contribute grass clippings and leaves and my kitchen produce waste and coffee grounds and tea bags. And I just strew it in there. It's important for a compost pile to have oxygen, to be aerated. And since I'm a lazy composter, I will just layer in some twigs, small branches to keep it loose, and maybe turn it once a year. The disadvantage or I have an advantage in this spot, and this is if you have room, is that there's a watering system for the hedge, which also waters the compost pile. And if it gets turned once a year, that's a major effort on my part. So it just sits there. The disadvantage of this location is a little bit shady, so it could use a little more sun, but it does heat up. And when I need compost for my gardens, I just shovel underneath it because the finished compost is at the lower level, close to the soil level. And you can also toss in, a couple shovels full of your garden soil to kind of inoculate it, and it'll keep going. So there's been science done, there's been discussion done, but there are some basic guidelines. What you want to do is to use components in both the green, which is nitrogen rich, and the browns, which are carbon rich, to feed your compost. And in this case, there's all kinds of information about relative amounts of these. Some people say 5% browns to greens, and you can create if you're a serious composter, you can create the right conditions to get your compost up to 130 to 160 degrees, which is hard in Idaho. But these are just some examples of things that you can put in, those that contribute nitrogen, which is actually, well, both of these are very important. Nitrogen is important for the fungi and the bacteria that will be breaking down in your compost. And then, of course, the browns create a living environment and contribute carbon to your finished compost. You can see here that just about all kinds of things go. Green garden waste, if you chop them fine, it's a little bit better. Flowers are fine from your garden, not flowers of obnoxious weeds, however. So those are things you would avoid. And you can add eggshells. This one is important for our area. Our soils are very alkaline, and wood ash is also very alkaline. So I would recommend that you never spread this on your garden soil. I once in a while from the fire pit, I'll sprinkle some in on my compost pile, but generally we have to avoid that unless you really have an active system going. What's fun about so many of these things is you can raid your neighborhood in your own gardens. All of these things are carbon rich, shredded newspaper, things that should be chopped up a little bit because it allows the microbes and the decomposers to work a little bit better if things are shredded or a little bit fine, but you don't have to be absolutely obsessive about that. And it's really fun because so much of this stuff, of course, is free. This is an important caveat on creating compost too, and I'm speaking to the confirmed and the people who already do some form of composting. But these things are no-nos. Anything that's meat or bone or oily or cooked, certain kinds of cooked food and dairy products and cheeses and fat and oil and grease, largely because they have a tendency to go anaerobic, even if you're now you can compost just about anything. You can, in the first slide that I showed you, the compost that came in from the feedlot, we knew they were composting whole cows because we would find some bones in there. But that was sweet smelling compost and well prepared. So be a little bit careful. The other thing is that if you do put these things in your compost pile, you'll attract dogs and cats and mice and other critters that'll dig in there. So my squirrels do dig a little bit and help me turn it over. But and here's another no-no, which is any type of manure, of this type of manure: kitty litter, dog manure, human manure, partly because it causes bad odors and also may contain some pathogens that would survive in your compost. This is another challenging one. You can put about anything green or brown, again, chop it up. Do not put anything like obnoxious weeds that have seeds, flowers that can go to seed even after you could pull it out, and those that have rhizomes or hardy roots, because they will not die and the seeds will be incorporated into your compost, because quite a few seeds have a fairly high resistance to decomposition. And then, of course, disease plants. It's okay to put in some sawdust from a project or a neighbor, but again, make sure the sawdust comes from any kind of wood that's untreated. We're going through some basics. Again, just a review of how to do a compost pile, some handy tips: save, acquire, get cheap organic components that you generate yourself. Part sun or part shade is best. If you're setting up a system, and we'll look at some examples of do-it-yourself and commercial systems that you can do. It's really good to have a water supply handy because you'll want to keep your compost moist, but not soggy. Maintain your layering. We can talk about relative amounts of each, but we need both of these, keeping the moisture consistently damp and not soggy. Again, it's that grab a handful and squeeze test. If you really want to keep track of how your compost is going, there are compost thermometers that you can insert to kind of keep track of how it's doing, and then you can adjust the amount of greens and browns that you use. Or you can just put your hand in it and kind of get a sense of what's happening with all these wonderful microorganisms breaking down the components in your, I think I just got photobombed here. Anyway, there's other things to do. And we'll look at some, there's probably one of the best techniques that you can use that's important is to construct your compost pile, try to confine it, not like ours, but not like mine, because we sometimes build small compost piles right in gardens and things like that, just for one season. But let's see, there's some techniques to either maintain the moisture or the temperature or allow it to cool. You can use block or straw bales to maintain the moisture and temperature. And then again, this caveat about it's important to allow oxygen into your pile. I've seen some really cool ones where you insert perforated pipes periodically in your compost pile, and it allows oxygen to get in because you don't want it to turn anaerobic. And then you can use my technique, which is layering in loose straw and twigs to keep things a little bit loose. But the goal is to get the temperature up, or at least to an optimal temperature, to allow the microorganisms to do their work. There's so much you can learn and get from Googling these days. When we first started these programs, we had slides and instructions and things like that. But now there's if you have a small space, there are some of these are a little pricey, but you can find good garden supply places that will sell you all kinds of great, both easy to use and more challenging containers. For a small yard, this is great, or something that's close to your kitchen door. This all works really well. Most of these have some way to collect or drain off instant compost tea that'll come out of your compost bins. These are great, expensive, but great. And then there's do-it-yourself, which we're all in favor of. It's easy to construct them. These just happen to be an idea as to perforate a big garbage bin and bury it in the soil to allow the organisms. And this is the other thing for all compost, is to either inoculate it with soil or have it in contact to the ground. And here's a couple that I've used that I kind of like, and I think a lot of our gardeners have. There's a nice mulch pile in the background. And this is nice because you can just continue to contribute to a pile like this, and you'll see somebody serious, they've got a thermometer there, and just add to it over the season and allow it to break down, and then you can just pull the whole thing apart. So it's a fairly simple design. These are made of mesh wire, and that's an easy way to do it. At our community gardens, one of our, how should you say, our requirements and the things that we encourage is composting. Every garden has some system for composting. This is a very nice system that was established at Westside Garden, and Eastside and others have the same system, which is a series of bins that are made out of pallets. And in this case, they're labeled to give gardeners some instruction. So basically, you start a compost pile and alternate greens and chopped, again, weeds chopped up just fine, but no flowers, no seeds, please, from anything that, or roots from anything that's obnoxious. And just start the process, and it allows you, you'll notice right here, these are bags of leaves that are lying in wait. And by the way, composting, which is great with the dark plastic and the sunshine. And this way it allows us to start a compost pile continue to add to it and then allow it and water it and allow it to rest and start another one. Take some of this, use it to inoculate the next bin. So if you have some elbow room, either one or two of these or even three of these, and you can usually get pallets free or nearly almost free, and allow you to set up system like this. This takes up a little more room, but you can do it with blocks on a small scale or with pallets on a small scale. And I mentioned as we start to collect in the off season, we don't use this for grass clippings because they become anaerobic and stinky. But just having some plastic bags full of moist leaves lying around is a very handy way. A lot of ours just pile up and get ready to be spread in the fall. But and notice that we do full scale composting at the garden too. Let's see. Oh, let me go back to this
Sue,
one. Yeah.
we have some questions that have come in. Can we take a little break before you go on to vermicomposting?
Oh, sure. Let's do
Okay.
it. And then this will remind me to say something else that I forgot. Okay, let's hear from our viewers.
Okay, so the first question is, if I'm using red plastic mulch, do I need to remove it in the fall or should I keep it there to cover the soil through the winter?
Christy, you may be able to help me with that better. I've used it.
I would definitely not leave it on the
Yeah,
ground.
I would remove it for a couple of reasons. One thing is you don't want too much cover, too much lack of oxygen, too much moisture underneath. Also, the plastic can usually be reused for at least a couple of seasons, and the reds and the greens and the purples are fairly expensive. So if they've survived the season, I would dry them and roll them up and save them and put them in. We don't, and I'll mention this again later, we generally don't leave plastic on the soil over the winter, with one exception. We need to in the community garden system, we have plots that are unused or in production or getting ready to be rented. And we often do cover with a heavy grade plastic just to solarize it and kill weeds. So that's one exception, I would say. Okay.
And to further answer that question, Sue, I would recommend, once you've taken that off the soil, you still want to keep your soil covered. So putting on a mulch of leaves or non-treated chopped up grass or chopped up old hay or straw, whatever you can get your hands on, do cover the soil, because that's going to increase the microbial life and it will keep the soil from getting compacted, but don't leave the plastic on.
Right, and that triggers what I think I may have mentioned, but I'll repeat again, Christy, is that, and this has to do with our soil, our moisture regime, our cold winters, is that, for example, in your garden after and don't over clean it in the fall. In fact, what I do is, if I have time, this also adds to this conversation, is, for example, heavy stalked plants like sunflowers or corn could be left up through the winter for a couple of reasons. One is they trap snow, and the other is if I usually cut them off at ground level, I prune at ground level and chop up and use the stalks and everything. But over the winter, they have such a nice root system, and that will just rot in place and contribute to the permeability of your soil to allow that important exchange, water and oxygen. And then if they need to be pulled in the spring, that's okay. And the other comment, and Christy touched on this, is, yeah, your soil has to be able to breathe. In our climate, the guideline is to do your heavy mulching in the wintertime. We layer on as much grass clippings, some compost, some sulfur, lots of leaves, several inches thick, and just let her rot over the winter. That does a couple things. It's amazing how this stuff will disappear and be ready maybe for a light tilling in the spring, or at least turning it over or planting through it, is because we have to we need to do some mulching in the spring. And we need to mulch the soil and say our pathways. But because our soil is still so cool into the early spring planting season, is you don't want to smother it in mulch at that time. You're going to want to start doing some mulching and cover cropping later on, but let's get that soil exposed to the sun. So,
That ties right into the next question.
oh,
which
great.
is, when do you remove mulch to hasten soil warm up or for planting?
Our Idaho climate is so crazy. Because, and again, I like to mulch some little pathways once I have my garden design laid out and for access to my garden. So I will do some light mulching, say to pathways to keep me from walking where I shouldn't. I would wait, if you've been mulching for the winter and you get so excited, I would just wait until, first of all, the soil has dried out, not dried, but you can walk on it without making footprints and compress it. And then you can mulch maybe some little pathways. What I do is, if we've done heavy mulching in the gardens and it's still quite a bit left to break down, I'll rake that away from the planting beds. And if it's too much, it'll already have some good breakdown in it. Just rake it up and add it to the compost pile because it's already underway in cold composting. So I hope that answered the question. Is just maybe, as anxious as we are, it can be, whoa, it can be well into April before we can really walk on our soil. And again, making small pathways with wood chips or something, or just pavers, to walk on pavers is a really good idea. So I hope that was advice for the caller.
Okay, now the questions are moving into to a combination of compost and mulch. Do you want me to go on?
Yeah, let me just go. I think I've overused this slide. Yeah, let's go ahead because we're gonna do a couple other things on compost and leave it. But if you're
Okay.
entertained by this slide, I'll go back. Let's go ahead.
This is a question about something that Elaine mentioned last year when she was here. She mentioned biologically complete compost, and this participant would like to know what that means.
Oh, biologically complete. Okay. Well, I'm going to let Christy chime in and anybody else, but I'll give it a stab. Biologically complete compost would be one that had been going through the normal process of decomposition. It will still have some bulk ingredients, for example, some bits of wood or green leaves, but mostly it has to do with, it's come to the point where after you've been doing your composting, you've really taken advantage of the fungi and the microbes and the worms and the critters in your compost that have basically gotten to the point where there's not much more they can eat or do. But it's also good to use your compost when it still does have some life in it, because you'll transport some of these beneficials into your garden. But I'm not sure that answered your questions, but biologically complete would be the organic material and also the living things that are in your compost. And
I agree, Sue, and I think what she's referring to also is that she's a big advocate of looking microscopically at your compost and seeing what your balance, particularly of bacteria and fungi, is. And so if you have a good balance of bacteria and fungi in your compost, you'll have some other of the many small little critters that are in there, then you've got something that is well-rounded. It's not all bacteria, which is the most common out of balance, is having it be too bacterial. But I think that that's probably what she was referring to, as being sure that you have a balance in your compost, which If you don't want to use a microscope, you can usually accomplish that by just paying attention to the balance of materials that you put into it and keeping your green and your brown in proper proportions. So,
Yeah, and I agree with that too. And even though to spread it or transport it, you want your compost, finished compost, be somewhat dry. But the other thing is one of the soil tests the soil test we do is to take a handful and smell it. And if it has that good earthy smell, then it's great to go. And even if it's a little dry, as you transport it to spread in your garden, you'll be introducing or transporting some of these good micro people into your soil, and they'll continue to work in your garden soil. So
so
Yeah,
here's
I just-
another question, Sue. How do you keep animals out of your compost?
mostly that's it kind of depends on where you are. My main compost digger, of course, are the squirrels, the introduced squirrels we have in our neighborhood. I fairly rarely ever see mice, but it's back to the components of your soil. Let's see how you might have to go a ways here. To keep intruders out and not attract other animals like skunks and cats and dogs is to make sure you don't use these top elements here in your compost. We'll go down to here anyway, because they have a tendency to break down anaerobically, but also some of their, a nice bunch of steak bones or something is going to attract the neighborhood critters. I'm in town, and so far I haven't had much trouble with this. Does that
Hold
help?
on to that slide for a minute once you're finished with this question, because the next one is connected to this slide.
Oh, great. So I hope that answered your question. Sometimes it has to do with, certainly with what you might be tempted to put like this into your compost. I find that my local squirrels and some of the little white-footed mice like things like squash seeds and things, and they'll do some digging. But they haven't been a real problem, especially by avoiding all of this here. Okay, let's.
Okay, so the next question has to do with this chart, and it says, do wood chips fall in the other category on this slide?
Wood chips, yeah, and you can use bigger ones to, if you're a lazy composter like me, layer that in. It allows more air to access. But I would say they're browns, depending on their size and how active your pile is, it'll take longer to break down. It's kind of other here as well to use wood ash and sawdust. They do take longer to break down, but they kind of add to a really nice carbon component, but also sort of the tilth of your compost pile, if you will. But again, avoid painted or treated woods. Don't grind up pallets because they've been treated. Otherwise, mooch whatever you can from your neighborhood in terms of the components of your pile.
Okay, just a couple more questions. Do diseased plants cure with heating of the compost?
You have to have a really serious monitored compost pile. Yes, you can kill the seeds of obnoxious weeds. You can kill the roots of bindweed or some of these others in your pile if you are keeping it to temperature. But we just discourage it because those guys are so persistent and so resistant. And also, if you have a few bits of root or seeds left in your compost, when you spread it, you're just going to reintroduce the obnoxious guys to your garden. So go ahead.
I was just going to say, it's a real challenge to monitor your compost. I mean, to keep it to the temperatures you need to destroy the disease organisms or the roots of really hardy plants. It's a very particular strategy, and it has to be monitored really carefully. So
Yeah, and it's fun to do, but it's something that like Chrissy said, really takes some focus. We're really obsessive in our home gardens and our community gardens about not wasting or throwing away anything that's green or brown, anything organic that we can use or just keep in our gardens. But there are some bad guys, like when we were getting rid of white top or bindweed, if your gardeners are familiar with those, or certain grasses. Those are pulled and put into a plastic bag and put in the trash. They are so doomed because they're really hard to control. They're aggressive and they don't go into the compost pile. So, okay, great questions. Do we have another one?
Can you compost more than leaves in the black plastic bags? And kind of in conjunction with that, are you going to touch on leaf mold?
For the first one, it's really just kind of not an obsessive, it's a very casual composting. When we start bringing in leaves to mulch the gardens in the wintertime, a lot of times they sit in those black plastic, which of course is going to absorb some heat, and they are moist and they start to break down. Generally, they are only in there maybe for a month or two for no particular reason. Some of them will go into our compost piles as to my compost pile as a brown. And it's something that we just do kind of casually, just because it's fairly easy to get leaves and also to put them in plastic bags. And the second part of, so it's just kind of a casual thing, like you can start gathering them in the fall and stash them somewhere, add some to your compost, and then mulch your garden with them. But if you have any leftovers, they just start breaking down and you can use them again in the spring for localized mulch and not up against your seed beds and not against your little starts.
But Sue, you're not attempting to compost, and you're not really attempting to compost in those bags. And
No,
you're not attempting to compost something besides leaves in there.
No, and like I mentioned earlier, you don't want to do grass clippings because they're very moist and they get really obnoxious like right away. It's wonderful mold that starts growing, but they get very odoriferous. And so leaves are loose and brown. It's just kind of a little easy opportunistic way to gather some more organic material and get that compost started.
And the question about leaf mold?
I guess I'm not quite sure. In terms of adding moldy leaves to your compost, that would be fine.
I think what he's referring to is as leaf, if you have a mat of leaves and as it breaks down, it becomes what we call leaf mold, even though it isn't moldy leaves. I mean, it is, they're decomposing.
Oh.
And we've used leaf mold very frequently at the East Side Garden with the kids in the sprouts beds, because it's compacted leaves. They're not anaerobic. They're fibrous enough that they don't go anaerobic, but they are breaking down and getting pretty compact, and they make a great mulch that will continue to decompose over the course of the summer and do all the good things that mulch do, but also building the soil. So that's how I've used leaf mulch, or sorry, leaf mold.
Leaf mold. Yeah, I wasn't sure it had something to do with pathogenic leaves. There's some that you probably would have to research, like if you're finding leaves on your trees that are showing signs of disease or mold, you might want to research that to see. But generally, good composting takes care of a lot. And I appreciate what you said, Christy, because you're covering the soil in the raised beds, or you can do it on the ground as well. And then you can, it's fairly innocuous, it'll keep breaking down, but you can actually move it aside and plant into the mulched area. So
one more question that is pertinent here. Are there certain tree leaves that we should not use?
Generally, there are a few trees and their leaves, and you can kind of observe this in the green belt of Idaho Falls. I noticed on this one that they do say put in pine and spruce needles. They are slow to break down. If you can get a source of them by, from a neighbor or a park, oh, be careful in the park. Anyway, they make wonderful mulches for pathways and things because they are slow to break down, and they seem to have just a slight effect on weed growth. There are some trees, oaks and walnuts. They've got a wonderful system because they have chemicals in their leaves, and as their leaves drop, and also the same for a lot of the conifers. You'll notice that under conifers, it's hard to grow anything. There's a lot of shade, but their needles and the leaves of some trees have
Hey, Pablo.
have compost.
How you doing?
Hi, have compounds in them which actually, how shall I say, discourage other plants from growing, from sprouting and germinating. So it's a kind of combination under these trees of shade, too much shade, and also the chemicals in some of these leaves. I think if you have a small amount of some of these other leaves, or you can make a separate pile, they will compost. They will break down eventually. It's partly because they're slow, and then they also have these chemical compounds in them. So if you're lucky enough to have oaks, or you're lucky enough to have some nut trees, that's great. But I hope that answered your question.
Okay, I think that's the end of these questions.
Okay, great. So everybody refresh your water bottles and we shall continue. Okay, it was an awfully fast, and this is a good point to say, to kind of advertise the community garden website as well. We'll be updating and adding not only these programs, but also references, and I won't have a list at the end of this program, but I'll try to keep adding. And nowadays when we can Google, there's just wonderful resources online about how to do some of these things. And the idea is try to be calm. Okay, we've looked at compost piles. The idea is just to do it. If you have a small garden and you've got a edge under a hedge, do it. If you've got a space to build a small bin like this, it'll be slow. You notice some darkness going on under here. It's breaking down. It's just the idea is don't put good stuff in the trash. Keep it going. Okay, this is another form of composting. Can everyone say vermiculture, which is worm composting? Again, this is a really fun thing to do. It's fairly easy. You can either do it simply in a bucket or a tote, or you can buy some really good equipment, or you can purchase things online that help you grow your worms in multiple stages. It's a good hobby. It's easy. I keep my worm my worm colony in the furnace pit over winter and just keep adding things to it, and then gradually harvesting the wonderful compost that these worms make. And you all should have worms in your garden too. These are special worms. Generally speaking, these red wigglers do not survive in our soil and are cold freezing. We haven't gotten to 36 inches of frozen ground for a while, but Sue Holt's listening in. If she is, she actually had some success with her red wigglers actually out in her garden as long as they were at soil level and heavily mulched. So I'll let Sue chime in, but generally you use these red wigglers, which can be purchased or mooched from somebody else. And you can take the compost from this and of course create compost tea as a drench or a spray. Use it carefully when it's finished and you'll return a lot of nutrients to your garden. I'm in favor of making things easy. Sometimes you don't have time or you don't have a compost pile, but you do have some space. A really easy thing to do is if you have an area in your garden that you finished gardening, or it's the fall, or it's the spring, is to just do trench composting. And that is to dig a trench or a pit in your garden and just put your kitchen debris in there. You'll see carrots and lettuce and celery and apples, should probably be peppers, chopped up. You wouldn't be able to plant there until probably the following year, although you could plant along the edge of this wall. And then you just cover it with soil and it goes. So I think Denise has had some experience with this at Eastside Garden. So if she wants to give any pros and cons. I mean, we want a garden for exercise and fresh air, but we want to make things easy, easy as well. So here's a pausing point. We just whipped through some of these subjects, and there will be links on our website to these different topics.
Sue?
Yeah.
In regards to trench composting, the one caution that I would put out there is that you have to be careful when you're trench composting that you don't have such thick amounts of material in there that you end up with your compost going anaerobic.
Aha, good idea.
Because then you're creating some not beneficial microbes that will be in the soil. So I would do that carefully if people want to try it with not great amounts of compostable materials piled up in one trench, but a fairly thin layer, maybe separated with some soil in between, and then another thin layer, so that you don't end up with the anaerobic situation.
Right, because we know there's also a battle going on in your soil between good, bad, and ugly. And so from what you said, Christy, this is probably too much, unless you live in a climate where things are a lot warmer and faster. But your recommendation would to take this material and spread it out in another trench, because that looks like a lot. That's a whole head of something, yeah, and a whole cucumber. Okay, thanks for the counsel. Okay, let's, I'm not watching the clock too closely, but let's get back to our mantra of no bare soil, please. It's really very, very important. And this is something that you can do in small batches or across a whole garden plot, is to introduce cover crops that are beneficial for your soil. They do a couple of things, actually 3 important things, maybe 4, is that they add what we would call green manure. This is a crop that you would grow basically to destroy, although some of them you can harvest from. So this shows, let's see, this is something, I'm not sure exactly what it is, in the mustard family. What the cover crops do is they protect your soil with shade. They're actively growing, and when the time comes, you can chop them down and chop them into your soil or move some to your compost pile. Their roots are penetrating the soil, which is very beneficial. And we're going to look at a couple different kinds. This is actually 2 summer type crops, cover crops. Let's take a look at another one. This is one of our favorites. It's called buckwheat. It's a fast growing, it's a warm season plant. It has nice flowers on it that attract bees and everything. It's very succulent. There's something else in here too, but there's buckwheat growing in here along the fence. There's a lot of things called buckwheats. There's this annual, there's the grain crop, there's wonderful perennials on our West Desert that are called buckwheats, and then there's a binding annual buckwheat, which is kind of a weed. But all of these are doing several things. They're growing and shading the soil, and they'll be beneficial when you cut them down. This is an important one. There's various varieties and mixes of cover crops. what we encourage is, this one is, I believe, a vetch. So it's a nitrogen fixture, nitrogen fixer, excuse me. So you want nitrogen fixers to be part of your seed assembly for cover cropping. Some are annuals, some are perennials, vetch, and you can use forms of peas. And I think, no, let's go back here. Uh-oh, I'm jumping ahead and I'm revealing. What you want is a mixture, and what we encourage is if you have a vacant plot or a large area, to go ahead and cover crop with annuals and maybe a mixture of perennials, which are some grasses and some nitrogen fixers. And those will grow, and then they'll regrow the next year, and you can scythe or mow them down, work them in, and keep this system going. Some are warm and some are cool weather crops. For the community gardens, we buy quite a few of these cover crops in bulk to share. Sources, the one source that I'm familiar with is Grimm Growers or Grimm Brothers in Blackfoot. And they will custom make mixes for home gardens or for pastures or for reclamation. And they'll, like I said, they custom mix them for the use that you need if you need low growing. Another component that's important in cover crops, I guess I don't have a picture right here, are some of the radishes, which is really fun because they often add these daikon radishes, these ones that grow if they can and get past hardpan, penetrate the soil. They all contribute this, but they penetrate the soil, then they rot and create channels for air and water to get into the soil. So this is another area that's really encouraged. You can cover crops. Say you've grown something in your garden and you have a period of rest for your garden, or you're in between spring and fall crops and summer crops. And even if it's just a small patch, is to go ahead and plant some of these beneficial cover crops. Okay. That's, does anybody have any questions at this point?
Any questions about cover crops, folks? I don't have any yet.
Okay, it's a big topic. And, you know, you can communicate with the Community Garden Association. Now, Christy's going to be busy starting seeds pretty soon, but you can make some queries to the speakers, to the gardeners, to our board, to experienced gardeners that we can pass on by just an email to the Community Garden Association. And that might prompt us to put in even more information on our website under resources. So education and outreach is, we don't have all the answers, but we can help you with specific questions. And if you ask a question that one of us can't answer, we'll send it on to somebody who has some expertise. So please communicate with us, because in our programs, we're going through some information fairly quickly. So, okay, back to talking a little bit about till versus no-till. Actually, organic gardeners have been practicing no-till for many, many years, whether they're home gardeners or they're growers of some kind. And I don't think, in a way, there's a lot of controversy. There's challenges if you're, you know, if you're a commercial grower of potatoes and grain and that sort of thing. But the whole idea comes back to reducing the impact and the loss of nutrients in your soil and loss of your soil as well by keeping things growing. So what we encourage now, when we've started some of our community gardens, we've had some challenges because the soil has been not soil or just dirt or just fine material like we did at one of our gardens. And the first thing we had to do was introduce life to it and improve the soil with organic material. So I guess we'll just go on. And this is kind of a quandary. At times, if you're starting a new garden You may have to remove weeds and grass, and then you may have to do a little bit of tilling or a small light plowing. But once you get your soil built up, you want to avoid disturbing it, because what you're after is keeping that active living layer of your soil going. And so there's ways in which we can kind of deal with this. Now, if you have this quandary and you have quack grass and you really want to reduce the disturbance to your soil, don't walk on it when it's wet, and do some other things. You take a shovel to it or a giant tractor or not. But some of the techniques that we use, and it does take some labor, is once your garden soil is in good shape, and you'll see slightly raised beds here behind this fellow and fairly good looking soil, is you just want to reduce the disturbance. You do not want to destroy that living layer of your soil. You don't want to turn it over to where the critters are killed, or oxygen, too much oxygen gets in and sort of oxidizes the organic material. So it's kind of scary looking, but it isn't too bad, actually. There are some tools that you can use. We just recommend that once you've built your soil well, is that you just absolutely reduce. You only plant in the areas you want to plant in, and you don't disturb the soil in other ways. And then so there are some handy tools which are familiar to some of you. Generally speaking, just a digging fork like this, a sturdy one, to just create one area for, say, planting a single tomato, or loosening the soil because you're having trouble with keeping your moisture content good, is to just use a hand tool like this digging fork. And then it comes in handy later for harvesting potatoes. But the idea is to minimize any dramatic turnover of your soil. Yeah. So anyway, this is, if you're if you have a large garden and you've gotten your soil to the point where you just really want to reduce disturbance, except in the areas you're going to plant, is okay, one of these monsters here. I just lost the name of it. Yeah. Christy knows what these are. We do have these in our
Broad fork, Sue.
Thank you, broad fork. I thought it was invented in England, but I'm not sure. Anyway, so what you can see here is that it's handy. It's got two handles, and it's handy for inserting into the soil. You do not turn the soil, but you just loosen it by rocking it back and forth. So you're basically introducing air and making some channels for water and roots to grow, and a bit of exchange of organic material from the surface to the subsurface. And then it's ready for planting. So thank you, Christy. I couldn't remember a broad fork. They're a little pricey, but they're really, really useful, and they're work, but not as bad as you think. Okay, back to some other hand tools, and we're not getting a commission on any of these companies except this one IFCCA really recommends. Back to this idea of minimizing soil disturbance, and actually, instead of bending over or kneeling, pulling all those little weeds, tiny weeds, they don't have much nutrition individually, and then putting them in a garbage sack and throw them in the trash. No, there's some really nice tools that you can use to do light weeding between your rows of plants. This one is a stirrup hoe, and this is a hoe, and this is a version of a winged weeder, which I understand was invented in Idaho. Other people take credit. This is an amazing tool because you can stand and shuffle it back and forth. This will shuffle back and forth, and it cuts in all those directions. And what it does is off with their heads. It just takes those little weeds down, and you just chop and drop. You just pull and drop and cut them off. This is one of my favorite tools for planting. It doesn't directly have anything to do with reading, but this is a hardy knife which has multiple uses as a handy garden tool. And I think we'll go on to the next one. Community gardeners are avid users of these cobra head weeders. There's some from the official brand and there's some knockoffs as well. What's nice about them is they're very easy to control with this sharp point and use it as a cutter, as a shuffler. You can get close to your plants and take the heads off of small weeds and lightly loosen the soil a little bit. And now they come in 3 lengths, which is really nice. They come in small, medium, and a long-handled one. So this is just for walking through your garden and decapitating small weeds and loosening the soil a little bit. It's just an example of, there's many different kinds of tools, but these are some that we use because we try not to waste anything organic. Other tools for gardening too is, especially if you're starting in an area that is challenging, or you're noticing some patterns of growth failure in your plant or in your garden, plants that aren't doing well, they're struggling, they're yellow. So you have to kind of observe and decide, is it the result of not enough sun or too much water, not enough water? But you're noticing some areas that are just seem to be struggling, which gives the hint that, and of course you're looking for good bugs and bad bugs and kind of looking at the tilth of your soil, is that there may be some micronutrients or nutrients that are missing in your soil. And so in some areas, especially if you're really opening up a new garden and you want to know what you're up against, is to do a soil test. I believe our local extension office, University of Idaho Extension Office, which offers the Master Gardener program and other training and help and demonstration gardens, etc. I believe you can get a container like this. And I'm not sure what the current price is, but they will do a basic soil test for you. There's a fee for that. And they'll have instructions on how to dig a hole and collect the sample, mix it in a bucket, and send it off for testing. Most tests, basic tests, will tell you mineral content of your soil, calcium, potassium, phosphorus, nitrogen. You can go further and get percent organic material, but it might help you. And then also you can go further if you're really struggling to see if there are any toxins in your soil that have come from some source, some soil that's been brought in, whether these are long-lasting insecticides or toxic chemicals or herbicides or something that you're trying to figure out. You can also have your soil tested for that, but that gets pretty pricey. So just keep mulching, it really helps. And then there's a special soil test that has come to the fore in the last few years. I just have one slide for this. It is under the outrageous name of Soil Your Undies. And what you do is you take clean cotton underwear and bury it for a season. They do this mostly to demonstrate the importance of low-till, importance of organic material in large farming operations, but it can be done in your local neighborhood if you want to. What they do is you have to mark the location, but you put this clean cotton material in various places, mark it where it is, and leave it for a season and see what it looks like. And I'm not sure I put, sorry, I didn't put in a picture, but if you have really good biologically active soil, most of these briefs will be completely broken down over a season. And if it's not, it's a very simple, non-specific soil test that you can do. And then you can just mulch again. So anyway, let's see, I think we're doing pretty well on time. So what I'm going to do is just encourage you again. There's lots to do and lots to think about. Gardening gives you muscles and gives you your tan and your exercise. You don't have to go to the spa or anything, but just spend time in your garden, look around, observe, Try not to panic, which we all do at least 6 times a year when you're trying to cover your plants in an Idaho windstorm. But this is probably another good pausing point. Christy,
Okay.
I think we're doing on time. It's 11:30 and we're ready to stick with everybody for as long as it takes.
So do you have more presentation, or is this the end?
This is just a little introduction to our next class. Shall I go ahead and do that?
Well, there are no questions at the moment, so
Okay.
I think we can go on, and then when we get to the end, we can open it up to even audio questions if you want.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I just wanted to, this is one we won't cover here. I've mentioned the importance of the right amount of moisture in your soil through proper irrigation, knowing your soil if it's too soggy and it's not draining. There's some tips and techniques that you can. It's really actually part of the Healthy Soils series. And back to the fact that if you have clay in your soils or you're all sand, what do? You add organic material. It helps with a lot of problem areas. But our next class will be focused on irrigation. It was actually requested by a number of people. And I think our speaker is going to kind of focus on home gardens and also some of the good devices and piping and things that you can use to set up irrigation. Obviously, proper irrigation is part of it. These are two things we do not recommend for irrigating your soil or your plants. Overhead watering is not good later on in the season. And let's see. So they'll cover such things as strip and tubing and sources of water and filters. So this is kind of getting into the hardware of gardening next time, but it all has to do with keeping your soils healthy as proper irrigation. And also we're faced with water quality and water conservation issues now and in the future. So this one should be good. Okay.
Okay, folks, if you have additional questions on any of the topics that Sue has covered or comments, we can, you can send them in via the chat, or you can, we can unmute you and you can ask your questions orally. So if there are any questions, let's get them going here. Take advantage of Sue's many years of knowledge and experience.
And we went through it really fast. So, and I appreciate the counsel of the people that are listening too. If you have any corrections or any further inspirations and under any of these topics, we would be glad to hear from you. So.
One note that did come in, you had asked Sue Holt about her red wigglers.
Yeah.
And she did note that they don't live in her garden. They live in the center of her compost pile where the temperature stays adequately warm, which probably means that the compost isn't heating up to the point where you'd be killing weed seeds and diseases, but it's sufficient to be breaking things down, because those little worms won't hang around if it gets too hot.
Right, that's my understanding too. Earthworms that we have are wonderful. And if you see them in your garden, you're doing things pretty right because they burrow and they feed on the organic material. But they're also accomplished, and they'll go deep over the winter to spend the winter in the soil, and they'll go really deep to escape the frost level and then survive the winter. But the red wigglers, you kind of need to have a colony for them and tend them, but they make wonderful compost.
Somebody's asked if, and you did discuss rototilling, she's wondering if she should have her husband sell the rototiller.
You know, with everything I go through, even gardening, I think, let's see, marriage, we should have a marriage counselor on the board. So, because these powered equipment can be really fun, and they can become really useful. What I would say is, if you're starting a garden and you're really trying to get that compost and mulch worked in, because you've done heavy mulching in the wintertime, and there's still lots of bits to work with in the spring, is, you know, some soil disturbance is necessary when you're starting the garden. But there's a point at which, and your soil will tell you by its tilth and its feel and its look and its smell, that it's doing just fine. And then I would limit the disturbances, which is what. And the other thing is rototillers. There's a time at which you really need to dig a hole or to turn stuff over in a beginning garden. For example, I've gone off topic a little bit, but at the West Side Garden, because of the components of that fill that were put in, you put water on it and it turns to concrete. And then we've gradually added, over the years, 20 years plus, we've added a lot of organics. But you go down about a shovel length or a little bit further and you hit hardpan, because there's chemistry going on with the clays that are made by that wet material. And so what I do is, the time I really dig deep is when I'm planting a new shrub, a new tree, and even a tomato plant, is I deliberately dig. It's just a few spots at a time in the garden, but I dig right through that pan to try to keep this whole process going. And I don't do it for the whole garden. But anyway, back to rototillers. There's a point at which they really aren't necessary. You can do light turning, you can use your broad fork or something like that. But the other thing is, they just really kind of, most of them that I've seen, just have only about a 6-inch depth, maybe 4 to 6, 8. And they just kind of fluff up the soil, a little bit of aeration going on. But once you get your soils in shape, I would cease plowing or rototilling. Occasional shoveling if you have to, but we're trying to.
We have a couple more questions that have come in. One is about, somebody is not going to be able to attend next week, and they're wondering if these will be recorded. And yes, we are recording them. Right now, we only have enough storage to leave 2 up at a time. We're trying to remedy that, finding a less expensive storage site than Zoom. So for the moment, there will be 2 classes posted, and you can access those links at the same place that you got your link to get into this Zoom meeting, on our class schedule page. Once we've got a greater amount of storage, we'll put all of them up and have links to them so you can view all of them. But right now we have the first and second class. Once this class goes up, the first class will drop off. So there'll be the 2 most current classes will be up there at a time. Another question is, how deep does the frost zone get in the coldest part of the winter?
Very good question. Mulch and hope for lots of snow. I don't have an image to pull up easily right now. I don't know if a person is new to this area, but you can get some hints about soil depth of freezing. Well, first of all, most of you know that, generally speaking, we have been in what's called zone 4, and you can you can pull up a map of the zones that will guide you in your planting from, say, Department of Agriculture updates this one pretty often.
So we're at zone 5 now, by the way.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, I don't do a lot of perennial planting in terms of shrubs and trees. I've been living here in Idaho for 50 years and came from the Midwest. If I'm going to invest in a special tree or something really expensive, I still have a tendency to choose toward zone 4. Don't expect us to drop back into that zone, which tells you something about the weather patterns year round, but also tells you about winter conditions. I've been practicing with zone 5 shrubs and perennials and stuff for years. So we're in a zone 5. So use that as a guide. In my experience, and I've lived in southern Idaho for a while, it's been a long time since we've had a really, really deep freeze. We do freeze our soil to a foot, foot and a half. I know, and I don't know how they still design new construction, but at my home, which was built many years ago, all of our utilities, that is our water system and everything, is at 4 to 5 feet. And that guidance was put out when we were zone 4 to make sure that these systems don't freeze in the wintertime. And there are other protections they use in basements and construction. I don't know if they're still following that guideline. I think we're well on our way for a while, at least, to stay in zone 5. Watch the weather this week because our high is going to be in the teens and our lows are going to be in single digits. Well, the other thing is to hope for snow, because besides skiing and beauty, snow makes an excellent insulator. So hope for snow this winter. And I just wandered around. I'm not sure I totally answered the question, but there are some resources out there to help you anticipate what the weather. Oh, there's the Farmer's Almanac, but I'm not sure about that.
Here's another zone question, Sue. When I buy zone 5 plants, they do not survive the winter. I'm starting to get zone 4 now. From my experience, I can't get zone 5 to survive. How do you do it?
Well, that's a really good question. You still have to be discriminating. And like I say, my cutoff for purchasing, especially zone 5s, are shrubs or trees, which have a tendency to be expensive, which is okay. I stick to zone 4 pretty much. If you walk the green belt in Idaho Falls, we do have a fairly nice community forest, if you will, with some of the shrubs and trees are marks with markers and information. I think part of it's luck. I plant both in a home garden area. I don't plant much anymore because we're full. But what I do is I protect them that first winter. I don't add a lot of fertilizer. I use compost. I dig a nice hole. I choose a planting time when those plants are dormant. And then I keep them properly watered and also protected those first winter or two. Because I know, for example, we all like roses, and there's hardy roses, there's flowering shrubs, there's shrubs with berries, but you really need to baby them through their first 1 or 2 winters.
How do you protect them, Sue? When you say you protect them, what do you mean?
Okay, I protect them by, actually the asparagus is asparagus is really hardy, but the way I protect them, I plant them in the spring or summer or fall, whenever the right time. What I'm protecting are the roots against frost heave and too much freezing while they're still new to the ground. And the other thing is to protect the crown of the plant, which would be, depends on the plant, but the depth would be right here. The crown of an asparagus is really close to the surface. Then that is mulched with leaves, just a light layer of compost, and you cover it. You don't have to worry about the stems themselves too much, but you would mound that all around here. You can also purchase various types of caps or covers. You don't want them to be totally, what's the right word? You still have to allow some oxygen exchange in there so they don't rot. But I really do protect them the first and probably the second year with just light dry leaves and really mound it up. Most of the time I leave the pruning of perennials until the early spring because they kind of capture moisture, and the birds like them for cover and food, and some of the insects too. So I usually don't cut them down or prune them until the early spring, like February. or early March.
So one of the strategies I've used for protecting plants through the winter that are a little bit marginal is I'll take a cardboard box and take the top and bottom out of it, set it over the plant in question, and then put dry leaves in it or really loose straw so that it doesn't compact. But the cardboard box serves to keep from getting the protection blown away in one of our winters, at least until the snow falls. And I've had quite good success with that. That would certainly work for plants in their first or second season until they get too big to be trying to do that process.
And that's great. Yeah, sometimes I've used tomato cages, or your cardboard boxes is great. And just make sure the leaves are loose, because we're in the process of mulching our garden somehow, some way in the fall when everything is pretty well down anyway. So you're going to be using leaves or straw. I know somebody who's growing a fig tree in zone 4, and they completely enclose it. It's too big to bring in the house, so they completely enclose it in a giant refrigerator box. And they're keeping a fig tree going, which I'm not sure is probably zone 8 or 10. They can keep, they're really serious. They're keeping this going in the Idaho winters. Our winters are milder, but you never know when we get hit. So is that good advice to people? You're mulching anyway in the winter, so you might as well do a little extra for some of your tenders.
Another issue that you have to think about when you're choosing for this zone is that the zone designation doesn't tell you when you're going to have your last frost or your first frost. And part of the problem for our plants, particularly fruit trees like peaches and nectarines, is that they will get buds frosted back and damaged multiple times in some springs, and that will eventually kill them. So that's a question of trying to choose the best microclimate that you have. The other thing that I've had trouble with is sun damage on the bark. And that happens in the winter when our temperatures will change a little bit, and then it'll get really cold again, and you can get bark splitting. And there are a number of strategies to try and prevent that, that will help you get them through the winter. But I think one of the biggest problems I've had has been with plant death from repeated frost that kills the buds, and the tree finally just goes, okay, done. This is too cold for me. So think about that when you're choosing the location for your plants. So we have, oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, picking up on what Christy was saying, maybe I should bring your face up too, Christy, but is choose your varieties right. Now we're lucky to have some, for example, hardy apricot varieties. The challenge there is that they're one of the earliest bloomers, and we love having them in the community garden and in the neighborhood because we want to start feeding those bees. And some of the earliest bloomers would be the apricot trees and the dandelions, of course. So it is kind of a crapshoot in terms of whether you're going to get fruit or not. But yeah, get some good advice on the varieties that you're planting.
Here's a compost question. Layering brown to green, a 3-to-1 ratio, and how to best go about layering. Do this by weight or volume?
I'm not obsessive by it, but I usually do it in that 3-to-1. Some say 5-to-1. It's critical to have both and not too much of the greens. I just do it by volume. And that's whether you're a lazy composter like me, or you're really working with bins or working with those wire enclosures or those bins made out of wood, or even better, blocks, cement blocks and things like that. It's just important to layer, and it is also important to turn them. Like I said, I'm a lazy cold composter, but it's really good to watch it and give it a turn, a sprinkle from the hose to keep the moisture right, turn it, and then start it all over again, alternating greens and browns. A lot of times what we're short on in gardens is the greens. And that's why I encourage gardeners not to put anything noxious, but certain in the compost bins, but certainly not throw all that free nutrients away. So gather them up and chop them up and add them to the compost pile, because normally that's what we're short on in the big community garden situation is greens. So should we bring your face back up, Christy?
No, it's fine.
Oh,
I've got a couple more questions for you.
okay, good.
Is it good to let the ground freeze so much before you heavily mulch to protect shrubs and trees in the winter? So I think it's a question about when should you get the mulch down if you're going to mulch to protect shrubs and trees before it gets cold?
I usually wait for berry bushes, strawberry beds, raspberries, tender perennials or semi-tender perennials. I really like them to be, in that case, it doesn't matter on an open garden, just start layering on the stuff as soon as you're pretty well finished with the season and it's not too wet. But I start putting the mulch on. I wait until the plants have gone, like roses, gone pretty well dormant. And maybe there's an inch or two of frost in the ground, because I don't, first of all, if I treat them too well, they might start growing again if we get a warm spell, which we can, in Idaho, we can really oscillate. But I usually wait until the plants are dormant and maybe there's, like I said, an inch or two of frost in the ground, and then I do the mulching, because we don't want to encourage them to come back alive again. We want to keep them asleep for the winter.
Okay, here's a cover crop question. Discuss when to plant cover crops so the cover crop doesn't shade the garden plants or compete with them.
Oh, that's a really good question. Generally speaking, especially if you're cover cropping, say a whole plot or a whole area, you don't have to worry about competition. I see, let's see, thinking about cover crops, I'm thinking about whether you're planting just for a short period of time, like buckwheat in the summertime, which germinates in like 5 days when it's warm. And really those are sacrificial lambs and they can get fairly tall and kind of angly, but I don't see that as a problem. If you're doing some of the more perennial cover crops, yeah, you have to worry a little bit about competition, but generally that type of cover cropping we do in the fall and let it recover again in the spring, and just there's some combinations where you can mow them down or scythe them down all through the season. Take some of the greens off, put them in your compost or somewhere in your garden, and they'll just grow right back, and you can keep that process going. We can mow and recover the green material from some semi-perennial cover crops in a plot that's not being used. We're just improving the soil, maybe 4 or 5 times a year from that particular setting. Of course, that's where you have a whole plot cover crop with a mixture of annuals and perennials. But I haven't really seen any problem, even if you're just putting them in a small patch somewhere, because they do shade the soil as well, and that's actually good. So I'm not sure I've comforted the person that asked the question.
Well, I think, Sue, that one of the ways of using cover crops that people do sometimes is to plant right into them. I think in our short season, that's a bit of a challenge, that if you're going to have a perennial cover crop, you would need to pull it back significantly from any place that you were going to plant. And if you're doing a short-term cover crop, either summer or something you put in the fall and it's going to come up in the spring, is you want to remove the bulk of that. The point of having it there through the winter is to keep roots in the soil so that for as long a period as is possible, you have the root exudates going out and feeding that biology. But once you go to plant your crop, because of our season conditions, the length of our season, I would advise removing the cover crop or cutting it so low to the ground that it dies. That would be optimal. Then the roots can decompose in place. Because in some experiments I did in conjunction with discussions I was having with Elaine, I planted tomatoes and corn right into an existing perennial clover cover crop. And they did significantly less well in the period of season that we had than the ones that were planted in soil with either a mulch or some other strategy. So I think you don't want to be trying to plant into your cover crops typically.
And that's an interesting experiment too, Christy, because we think in terms of clovers and nitrogen fixers as being robust and contributing nitrogen, but there was probably a combination of things. There was too much competition. Perhaps, I don't know what your feeling was, too much competition with the cover crop, perhaps. Also, you need some, it's that balance between needing that sunshine warmth on your soil to keep your soil warm for germination and growth. And so there was some competition there. That's very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, it was. I don't see any other questions. Let me just quickly go back and see if I've missed anything. I don't see any. So I think we've covered as many questions as people have put forward.
Well, if people fallen asleep or left to go shopping, they should wear their masks if they are. But yeah, normally we advertise the program to go. You guys are sort of blessed because I started out with like 80 slides. That's so much in each of these topics. So I really appreciate the attendance and the questions. And shall I go ahead and stop the share for now, Christy, or?
Yeah, I think that would be fine, Sue. You can just wind up and I'll say thank you to you on behalf of all these attendees for your class. And we're getting many little notes saying thank you to you as well. So appreciate your time and the effort that goes into getting these ready.
Well, I really enjoy this, and I really enjoy the questions and the feedback as well. And I'm sitting in my office, which is a terror. It's pretty awesome and scary, and looking out into the snow. And we all need that green fix at this time. And said, okay, stay tuned next time for all important irrigation. They're going to talk about the importance of water conservation. And also, this will be a fun one. Somebody asked about it, whether they should get rid of their tiller. Now you'll have an opportunity to buy all these cool connectors and tubes, because the idea is to water at ground level. So I won't launch into that topic, but the idea is for your plant health, you need to keep the right moisture in the soil, conserve water, and after a certain point, no overhead watering. So give you a chance to go out and buy a whole bunch of cool stuff.
Okay, well, thanks everybody. Thank you again, Sue. And watch the website sometime this weekend. This class will probably be posted. And we hope we'll see you next week virtually.
Yeah, and Chrissy, I think it's not as informative, but I know what we can do, because the interaction and the voice is so important, but we can at least put our PowerPoints on the website resources for whatever good that does. We have some actually already on soils and mulching and compost.
There's also on our website, when you go to the main menu, you'll see a link for healthy soils. It takes you directly to our current videos and resources for healthy soil information. So if you are just getting warmed up to this topic, please feel welcome to go there and check out the many excellent resources that are linked to from that page.
And I think that also takes us into some recordings and information from Elaine Ingham, who's our soils guru that we go to for such wonderful information. So some of her materials are there. And we'll try to put a few more links on compost and cover cropping too, but there's a lot there. Or send a question and we'll make up the answer. Anyway.
Okay, thanks everybody.
Okay, thank you, Christy, for monitoring and mentoring.
You're welcome and so long. We'll see you all next week. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.